Hello and welcome back to another episode of Goji's Thrift Box, the series where I reach into my little treasure chest of vintage toys and explore their origins. What's coming out of the Thrift Box today? Well, it's October, it's spooky season, so we may see something monstrous today.
Hello, kiddies. You caught me in the middle of my homework. Your old pal, the Crypt Keeper's a real believer in continuing deducation.
Time to howl at the moon as we take a deep dive into the depths of the Crypt. Our journey begins in 1944 with the foundation of Educational Comics, which was founded by publisher Maxwell Gaines. Gaines was a veteran of the comic book industry, having been part of the group that published Funnies on Parade in 1933, a precursor to American comics, and he was an editor at All American Publications, the publisher that first chronicled the adventures of superheroes like Wonder Woman, Green Lantern, and Hawkman. Gaines' plan with Educational Comics was to market comics about science, history, and Bible stories to schools and churches, later expanding to children's humor titles. But tragedy struck in 1947 when Max Gaines was killed in a boating accident. Max had a son, William Gaines, who had spent 4 years in the Army Air Corps and returned home to finish school at New York University, planning to work as a chemistry teacher. William Gaines had a somewhat contentious relationship with his father and showed no interest in going into the business of comic book publishing. But after his father's death, at the request of his mother, William did take over as the publisher of Educational Comics. Unfortunately, sales of Educational Comics were not great, and the business was in trouble. William was brainstorming with one of his editors, Al Feldstein, on what to do to increase sales. The two men found that they shared a love of horror-themed radio shows from the 1930s that they grew up listening to. Shows like Lights Out and The Witch's Tale.
We bring you The Witch's Tale, written and produced by Alonzo Dean Cole. And now let us join old Nancy and Satan, her wise black cat.
Hannah and 17-year-old I be today. Yes, sir, Hannah and 17-year-old. Well, Satan, if these folks will just douse out their lights, we'll spin another of our little bedtime stories to ruin their night's rest. That's right. Nice and dark and careful now. Draw up to the fire and gaze into the embers.
Taking that as their inspiration, they published a few horror stories in some of their existing comic books, and the response from young readers was extremely positive. After that, EC Comics, now known as Entertaining Comics, converted 3 of its existing titles to all horror. Those 3 titles became The Vault of Horror, The Haunt of Fear, and Tales from the Crypt. Each of these titles established their own horror host, a character that would guide readers through the stories with dark humor and ghoulish puns. Tales of the Crypt was hosted by the Crypt Keeper, The Vault of Horror by the Vault Keeper, and The Haunt of Fear by the Old Witch, a character that was inspired by the Witch's Tale radio program. The 3 EC horror hosts were collectively referred to as the Ghoul Lunatics. These 3 horror hosts would often appear in each other's books, and they would have a good-natured rivalry with each other. The stories in these titles often read as morality plays, where those that perpetrated evil received poetic justice in a number of creative and grisly ways. These stories would often feature macabre visuals, everything from dissection to decapitation. EC's horror titles became some of the hottest-selling comic books of their day, with sales rivaling the ever-popular superhero genre. Their popularity did not go unnoticed by other publishers, who soon started publishing their own horror comics, with each publisher turning up the gruesomeness of the stories to try to out-EC themselves. As a result, Gaines, Feldstein, and their creators found themselves having to turn up the amount of gore and violence in their own books in order to compete with the copycats. The content of comic books during that time did not go unnoticed, especially by teachers and parents. There was growing criticism from the public about the content of the comic book industry, resulting in backlash and comic book burnings across the country. This all came to a head in 1954, with the publication of the book Seduction of the Innocent by psychologist Frederick Wertham. In his book, Dr. Wertham blames comic books for juvenile delinquency in America. Every generation has its boogeyman. From rock music to video games, rap lyrics to violent movies, Dungeons and Dragons to, at the time of this recording, apps like TikTok. And in 1954, it was comic books that were destroying the youth. This was followed by congressional hearings to explore the problem of juvenile delinquency. At these highly publicized hearings, William Gaines requested to speak, to defend his comic books and his right to publish them under the tenets of free speech.
I was the first publisher in these United States to publish horror comics. I'm responsible. I started them. Some may not like them. That's a matter of personal taste. It would be just as difficult to explain the harmless thrill of a horror story to a Dr. Wertham as it would be to explain the sublimity of love to a frigid old maid. What are we afraid of? Are we afraid of our own children? Do we forget that they are citizens too, and entitled to the essential freedom to read? Or do we think our children so evil, so vicious, so simple-minded, that it takes but a comic magazine story of murder to set them to murder, of robbery to set them to robbery?
Unfortunately, Gaines' appearance had the opposite effect of what he intended, as the public now had a face to put to the perceived problem of juvenile delinquency, and that face was William Gaines and EC Comics. Eventually, the comic book industry relented, and to prevent government oversight, they established a self-policing body called the Comics Magazine Association of America, which created the Comics Code Authority, a regulatory board that oversaw the content of comic books. The authority placed a ban on a wide number of things appearing in comic books, including images of zombies, vampires, werewolves, and even words such as horror, terror, and weird on the cover. Basically everything that made EC Comics popular. Gaines initially refused to join the association, but changed the format of his comics to fall within their rules. Unfortunately, he found that without the stamp of the Comics Code Authority, no distributor would carry his comics and bring them to newsstands. So eventually, under protest, EC Comics did join the Comics Association. But even then, Gaines found that the association was putting up roadblocks to prevent EC Comics from being published. This all came to a head in 1956, and a story called Judgment Day, published in Incredible Science Fiction number 33. This story was a reprint of a pre-code book from 1953. During EC Comics' run, they would explore many progressive themes, including racial equality, environmentalism, and anti-war themes. This particular story saw an Earth astronaut exploring an alien world where two different colors of robots existed. Finding that one race of robots was prejudiced against the other, the astronaut recommended that the planet not be allowed to join the Galactic Republic until their racism problems are solved. In the final panel, the astronaut removes his helmet, revealing that he is a black man. The Comics Code Authority attempted to block this story, telling Gaines that the astronaut could not be black. Gaines threatened to go public with this ruling, revealing the bigotry of the Comics Code Authority, who finally relented and allowed the story to be published. And that was the last comic book story published by EC, as Gaines could no longer tolerate the stifling of creativity that EC was facing. But EC did keep one title in publication, a humor comic book called Mad, that was transitioned to a magazine format. Mad Magazine became one of the best-selling periodicals in America during the 20th century, at its height selling 20 million copies a month. Even though EC's horror comics were gone, they had left an indelible mark on the young readers that enjoyed them, some of who grew up to become horror creators in their own right, such as comic book artist Bernie Wrightson, the co-creator of Swamp Thing, authors Stephen King and R.L. Stine, and filmmakers John Carpenter and George A. Romero. EC's horror tales first journeyed out of comics in 1972, when British filmmaker Amicus Productions released the film Tales from the Crypt, based on the old EC comics. This film starred Joan Collins, Peter Cushing, and featured Ralph Richardson as the Crypt Keeper. A sequel based on The Vault of Horror followed in 1973. In 1978, publisher Russ Cochran began releasing the complete EC library. This project reprinted almost every EC comic in 66 hardcover volumes, bringing these classic horror stories to a new generation of readers. Throughout the 1980s, the influence of EC horror comics could be found in various media, such as the anthology comic book series Twisted Tales, published by Pacific Comics, and the film Creep Show, released in 1982, written by Stephen King and directed by George A. Romero. In the late 1980s, a group of Hollywood heavy hitters, including Richard Donner, Joel Silver, and Robert Zemeckis, wanted to do a Tales from the Crypt feature film. This idea morphed into a television series to be broadcast on HBO. The series Tales from the Crypt premiered on HBO on June 10, 1989, and ran for 7 seasons of 93 episodes. Featuring an opening theme by Danny Elfman, the series was hosted, just like in the comics, by the Crypt Keeper, who for this series was reimagined from an old man into a reanimated corpse, brought to life by an animatronic puppet with a voice provided by John Kaser. Just like in the comics, the Crypt Keeper retains his love of gallows humor, bad puns, and of course his trademark cackle.
It's good to see two lovers so batty about each other. Now that's a relationship they can sink their teeth into.
Because the series did not have to adhere to broadcast standards, being a cable show, the stories could include graphic violence, profanity, sexuality, and nudity for adult audiences. Tales from the Crypt attracted a who's who of Hollywood talent, both in front of and behind the camera. Notable stars to appear on the series include Adam West, Arnold Schwarzenegger, Benicio del Toro, Bill Paxton, Billy Zane, Carol Kane, Catherine O'Hara, Dan Aykroyd, Don Rickles, Ernie Hudson, Joe Pesci, Katie Seagal, Kirk Douglas, Meatloaf, Michael J. Fox, Ted Danson, Tom Hanks, Whoopi Goldberg, and the list goes on. Most of the stories in the series were taken directly from the original EC comics. EC publisher William Gaines was called in by the producers to consult on the pilot episode, and the suggestions that Gaines made for that episode informed the entire series going forward. In 1993, an animated Saturday morning spin-off was created by Canadian animation studio Nelvana. Tales from the Crypt Keeper ran for 2 seasons between 1993 and 94, and then returned for a 3rd season in 1999. Tales from the Crypt Keeper featured the same type of stories as its parent series, but of course much toned down for a younger viewing audience. John Kaser remained as the voice of the Crypt Keeper for the series, and some episodes would also feature his ghoul lunatic partners from the original comics, the Vault Keeper and the Old Witch. A 3rd series called Secrets of the Crypt Keeper's Haunted House premiered in 1996. This was a game show for young people, with teams of kids competing with each other in a series of challenges. Once again, John Kasser provided the voice of the Crypt Keeper, who acted as the animatronic host of the program. Tales from the Crypt also spawned a series of feature films. 1995 saw the release of Demon Knight, followed by Bordello of Blood in 1996. A third film from 2002 called Ritual was not originally released as a Tales from the Crypt tie-in, but upon its home media release in 2006, the Crypt Keeper was added as host, making it retroactively part of the series. To coincide with the Tales from the Crypt Keeper cartoon, Ace Novelty, a company best known for making the famous Troll dolls, released a series of Tales from the Crypt Keeper figures. That included 2 different versions of the Crypt Keeper and 6 classic monsters who all appeared in the opening credits of the cartoon: Vampire, Frankenstein, Mummy, Zombie, Gargoyle, and Werewolf. Ace also released 2 larger-scale talking Crypt Keeper dolls, one dressed in a tuxedo, the other dressed in a Hawaiian shirt. This is the werewolf from that Tales of the Crypt Keeper toy line, and as you can see, he is very much a 90s toy. And what I mean by that is he is sculpted in that very posed, squat stance after the huge popularity of Teenage Mutant Ninja Turtles. A lot of 90s toy lines came out in this particular style. Not much in the way of articulation. His arms can go up and down to slash. His legs can move back and forth. Not much movement in the tail. That sort of stays in place. And no movement in the head because he has an action feature. This lever on the back, if you press it down, he will snap at you. Close-up of his face, he does have a very cartoonish look about him. There is some nice paint in the eyes, red and yellow. There were a plethora of monster and mutant toys in the 90s. And compared to a lot of them, the Tales from the Crypt Keeper monster figures are pretty generic. He is a nicely sculpted figure, but compared to a lot of the colorful characters that came out in lines like Ninja Turtles and Toxic Crusaders, Bucky O'Hare, all those types of lines, he really doesn't stand out in a crowd. This comic book we've been looking at is a reprint done by Gladstone Publishing in 1990, and this reprint stories from 1951 and 1953. And you can see the 3 horror hosts right there: Crypt Keeper, the Old Witch, and the Vault Keeper. And this one features a werewolf story. That's why I picked this book, since I'm reviewing a werewolf figure. And we get stories from all 3 of the ghoul lunatics in this issue. So we start off with this story hosted by the Crypt Keeper. And we move on to the Vault of Horror with the Vault Keeper. And here we have the 3rd host in the Old Witch. EC pretty much invented horror comics with the grisly twist endings. And no matter who does horror comics from here on out, they will always be compared to EC. At the time of this recording, all episodes of HBO's Tales from the Crypt and every episode of Tales from the Crypt Keeper are available to watch on YouTube. I'll link to those channels in the description of this video, in case anyone wants to do a little Halloween binge watching. At the height of its popularity in the 1990s, the creators of Tales of the Crypt were hoping that the Crypt Keeper would become a perennial symbol of Halloween, just as Santa Claus is for Christmas. I don't think that really happened. If you go into a Halloween store currently, characters you often see are Jack Skellington, Beetlejuice, and the Sanderson sisters. So although I'm sure people remember the Crypt Keeper, I don't think he became a perennial holiday favorite. But in this era of constant rebooting and recycling in Hollywood, it's only a matter of time before the Crypt Keeper returns. I just hope they keep him as a cheesy looking animatronic puppet and not try to do some sort of fancy CGI. But as always, thank you for your time and attention, and I will see you in the next video.